Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Well, here we go. The Tibetologist Donald S. Lopez begins his book, The Tibetan Book of the Dead, a biography, with the following anecdote. In 2005, he says, I received a telephone call from a newspaper in New Jersey. The journalist had seen a press release about a new translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and thought he might write a story about it. I referred him to a recently published scholarly study of the Tibetan text, but he thought if I could answer a few questions. Is the Tibetan Book of the Dead the most important work in Tibetan Buddhism? No, I said. Do all Tibetans own a copy? No, I said. Have all Tibetans read it? No, I said. Is it a work that all Tibetans have heard of? Probably not, I said. Before I had a chance to explain, says Lopez, the reporter, sounding somewhat bewildered, thanked me and hung up. Now, Lopez does not immediately fill in the missing details that baffled this poor reporter, and in order to avoid anybody hanging up during the course of the talk or now, I'm going to give you some missing context. Buddhism begins with the life, enlightenment, and teaching career of one man, Gautama Siddhartha, using the Pali name, Pali being a language, who at some point in Indian history, before the so-called common era, scholars cannot agree on a date, only agreeing on disregarding the Indian traditions, Siddhartha left house and home and sought liberation in the tradition of wandering ascetics called Shramanas. He claimed to have penetrated to the root nature of the human condition, seeing behind the facade of mundane existence, declaring it to be dukkha, traditionally translated as suffering, but modern commentators prefer the word sometimes unsatisfactoriness. But he also claimed to have rediscovered a path or middle way between the extremes of sensual indulgence and ascesis, which led to the peace of Nibbana, Pali, or, as it is perhaps better known, Nirvana, through the practice of an Aryan or noble eightfold path, consisting of stages of morality, meditation, and wisdom. This state of peace was something which could be experienced, quote unquote, in this very life. After the death of the Buddha, scholars have detailed three major phases of development of the movement that honoured his teaching. The first phase of the Hinayana, more on that term in a moment, a second called the Mahayana, and a third called variously Tantrayana, Vajrayana, and a number of other terms. Hinayana literally means small vehicle, and was a term coined by the later Mahayana followers who contrasted it unfavourably with their own greater vehicle. The difference was in scope of intention and resultant insight. The Hinayana, which some have more charitably tried to rename the Shravakayana, or path of the hearers, studied the recorded teachings of the Buddha, and their spiritual ideal was the Arhat, or Arahant, the disciple who had achieved nirvana like the Buddha, but who did not play the same role in the cosmic economy as the supreme Buddha, Sama Sambuddha. The Mahayanists developed their own literature. HBB indicates that the texts were transmitted via adepts. Thus, when sutras are said to have been revealed by the king of the serpents of a later date, it was adepts who were meant, for example, and they aimed at supreme Buddhahood, usually through the taking of the bodhisattva vow to liberate all sentient beings, and through the practice of the transcendental virtues, familiar to all of us through HBB's translation of the Voice of the Silence, over countless lifetimes. This process was over countless lifetimes, so you're talking about millions of years of development. The third phase of development is described by Hans Schumann in his quest book, Buddhism, thus. The Tantrayana is an occult Buddhism which arose in the 2nd century AD and made its literary appearance from the 6th century onwards. The Tantra literature uses twilight language, which stands between light and shade, between assertion and concealment. Philosophically, the Tantrayana builds on the Mahayana, but modifies or extends its principal tenets in several ways. The ideal of this vehicle is sometimes depicted as the Siddha, or adept, and the aim is often stated as the achievement of supreme Buddhahood in a single lifetime, thus not through millions of years of development. As Evans Wentz tells us in a footnote to his translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the great straight upward path. One of the doctrines peculiar to Northern Buddhism is that spiritual emancipation, even Buddhahood, may be won instantaneously without further suffering on the age-long pathway of normal evolution which traverses the various worlds of samsaric existence. Samsaric is the phenomenal realm of suffering previously described by the term dukkha. So where does the Tibetan Book of the Dead fit into this? It is a tantric work stemming from the 3rd or tantric phase of Buddhism. We just need a few more details to be in a better position than that poor reporter, who's possibly still scratching his head. Buddhism entered Tibet twice. The 33rd king of Tibet, 7th century Common Era, had 2 wives, one from Nepal and one from China. Now, I've heard different accounts about this king. Some accounts say that he was converted to Buddhism by his wives, who were both Buddhists, and the other ones was he agreed to introduce Buddhism into Tibet to keep his wives happy. Maybe we'll never know the answer to that one. But anyway, that was how Buddhism came into Tibet. If we discountenance the story of how the Buddhist scriptures fell out of heaven in a casket during the reign of an earlier monarch. Later kings built on the movement, one inviting the monk Shantarakshita to Tibet. But there was opposition, human and otherwise, from various natural forces, according to legend, and Shantarakshita suggested that the tantric master, Padmasambhava, be invited to dispel all obstacles in the latter half of the 8th century. This was done, and this altogether constitutes the early spreading of the Dharma, or Buddhist teaching, in Tibet. However, at a later stage, due to an evil king, Buddhism went into retreat in Tibet until the king was murdered by a monk. Tibetan chronicles praised the monk for the compassion he showed by stopping the king generating any further evil karma by continuing to persecute Buddhism. And after a period of political chaos, a prince invited another Buddhist master, Atisha, to Tibet in the 11th century Common Era. It is from this period that the different schools or teaching lineages of Tibetan Buddhism stem, with one exception. The Nyingmapa, which means the ancient ones, to quote Lopez, did not trace itself to pilgrimages to India or recently arrived Indian masters. It did not invoke oral instructions passed from master to disciple. Instead, it looked to the distant past, i.e. the first transmission of the Dharma, and to the written word. A central teaching of the school is that of Dzogchen, which argues that one's true nature is like a mirror which reflects with complete openness but is not affected by the reflections, or like a crystal ball that takes on the colour of the material on which it is placed without being itself changed. Compare HPB Voice of the Silence, Fragment 2. For mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul. The Nyingma tradition is the source of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It is, specifically, a terma, of the Nyingma school. I'll define terma in a little while. So, finally meeting our reporter once again, the reason why the work in question is not the most important work, which is a subjective question anyway, isn't it? The reason why it's not the most important work of Tibetan Buddhism is because it's not actually in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, and there are different recensions of the Tibetan Buddhist canon, the Kanjur and the Tantra, but it's not in there. And remembering that the Nyingma stuck to the older texts and traditions, and it's a late work by a less dominant school, because the dominant school of Tibetan Buddhism is the Gelug school. So that's why Lopez said most Tibetans probably haven't heard of it, certainly haven't read it, and so on and so forth. It's a very particular text in a very broad tradition. Yeah? As a tantric work, also, it was not intended to be used outside of the initiatory traditions that surrounded it. More on that later too. I've mentioned that the work we're examining is a terma. According to the tradition, Padmasambhava left behind a number of texts in the 8th century called termas, variously described, and this is the traditional formula for describing them, as being hidden in rocks, in trees, or the mind streams of disciples. It's a lovely term, that, isn't it? Mind stream. That's from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Well, it's broad, the whole Buddhist tradition has the idea of a mind stream. We're not people, we're not bodies, we're a mind stream manifesting. Anyway, so these termas, or texts, were to be discovered at a later date when they were needed. As Lopez puts it, in the 11th century, as the new sects of Tibetan Buddhism claimed authority by going to India to retrieve Indian texts, the ancient sect, Nyingmapa, began to discover its own authoritative texts without having to go to India. The texts had been concealed in the Tibetan landscape centuries before. According to tradition, Padmasambhava himself predicted the discovery of this particular terma and its discoverer, or terton, Karma Lingpa. So, to benefit the sentient beings of this degenerate age, I have committed this cycle of teachings to writing and concealed them at Mount Gampadar. In that age, a supremely fortunate son will be born. He will be the courageous Karma Lingpa. On his right eye there will be a mole, resembling the eye of pristine cognition, and he will be born in the dragon or snake year. And then it goes on to give some further details, which I've abridged heavily, but he should not publicly teach the cycles of the peaceful and wrathful deities. Then it goes on, when 7 years have passed, it's now talking about a successor to Karma Lingpa, that third generation successor may properly impart to others the empowerments and practical application of the abridged cycle, the great liberation by hearing during the intermediate state. Again, to quote Lopez, everything in Padmasambhava's prophecy uncannily came true. I put a little exclamation mark in square brackets after that quotation. I think Lopez has a somewhat dry sense of humour. I read a book by him once called Prisoners of Shangri-La, Tibetan Buddhism in the West, where he describes how Buddhism has become an academic enterprise with scholars and conferences and monographs that have to be footnoted and sources have to be cited. And in that paragraph where he's describing this process, he gives a footnote, and you turn to the notes at the back of the book, and he's put, couldn't resist. So, what was not announced in the prophecy, alas for Karma Lingpa, is that he chose the wrong consort. Remember, Karma Lingpa was not a monk and practiced some form of consort yoga, as it's described. And if you can't guess what that is, I'm not going to draw you any diagrams. And unfortunately for Karma Lingpa, the wretched consort ran away with his attendant before he had found all of the termas announced in the prophecy. And then, unfortunately, she came back. And I say, unfortunately, she came back because she and the attendant then proceeded to poison Karmalingpa. But the full details of that particular event need not detain us. However, returning to Lopez, he says, among the many biographies of the great treasure revealers of the Nyingma sect, that of Karmalingpa is one of the less glorious. His untimely death left much undone. His father and son are said to have found among his possessions various manuscripts connected with the series of funeral rites that would come to be known as the Bardo Todol, liberation in the intermediate state through hearing. The task of consolidating the text seems to have fallen to Karmalingpa's son and to his son's disciple. Transmission via a family is not particularly uncommon in these particular schools of Buddhism. It's not always, I must say, because they were not monks to begin with. It's not a monastic order. It's kind of like a family lineage. Same way that certain forms of folk music are passed down along a particular family. Yeah? Lopez also suggests that later monks had a hand in collating and organising the cycle of texts. So what we actually have is a secret text, assuming we take the origin with Padmasambhava to be true, partially discovered and then worked on by several pairs of hands over time. Okay? And this is in essence what Walter Yeeling Evans-Wentz published in 1927 as a translation by the Lama Kazidawa Samdup of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One thing to understand, given the nature of the schools transmitting the text without a central authority, and the nature of printing and book publication in Tibet, is that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not a book in the sense that we now get it, you can buy it from a bookshop now. It's not a book in that sense. It is in actual fact a cycle of texts, and there is no one version that has everything. To quote Lopez again, the Bardo Todol is not a single text, but rather a cycle of texts. The number of texts in the cycle varies. There are often between 15 and 20, which are in turn drawn from a much larger cycle. The block print of the text that Evans-Wentz purchased had 17 individual texts. In his study of the history of the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, Brian Cuevas has examined 21 editions of the Karmalingpa cycle and identifies 3 as central to the performance of funeral rites. Of these, one is clearly the most important, the rite which conferreth of itself liberation in virtue of propensity. But he, Evans-Wentz he means, does not translate the work that is most commonly read to the Tibetan dead. The 3 texts from the larger collection that Evans-Wentz selected for translation were the reminder of the Bardo of reality, the description of how the wrathful Bardo appears, and the identification of the Bardo of becoming. However, the tradition has generally regarded the first and third of these as meditation manuals to be employed by advanced tantric practitioners. They are not part of a typical Tibetan funeral ritual. The irony is that Evans-Wentz selected 2 texts for the living and called them the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That may be a little bit harsh, I think, but certainly the cycle is concerned with after-death states, even if it's a meditation as such. But Evans-Wentz's version went through several editions, each adding more material in the form of prefaces by Carl Jung, Arthur Avalon, Anagarika Govinda, and Evans-Wentz himself. Added to this are the copious footnotes that he provided, and his particular version of the book has more commentary to it than the original text. Other translators have also entered the fray at various times, including a psychedelic version by people who should have known better. The most recent edition, currently available from Penguin Books with a preface by the Dalai Lama, claims to be the first complete translation, but it sidesteps the issue of different collations of the text. A brief biographical aside on Evans Wentz would not be out of place here. He was a lifelong theosophist, staying with Catherine Tingley at the Point Loma TS, that's the judge group, although he also met Annie Besant and a number of other prominent figures at Adyar. He was, apparently, an avid collector of texts he could not read in the original language. He had a collection of Pali palm leaf manuscripts as well as his Tibetan works. Irrespective of whatever views we take of the work under consideration, his contribution to that published book is a mine of theosophical insight, and the text is worth reading for that background information alone. Given the popularity of his cycle of Tibetan works, it's no surprise that theosophical influences keep popping up in the most unexpected places. Because remember, his version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead was never published by TPH. It was published by, still is, Oxford University Press. And so people are buying a book from a respected academic publisher, and it's basically got pure theosophy put in there by the editor. Anyone wishing to find out more about Evans Wentz can read the only biography of him, and as it's the only biography of him, I suppose it's the definitive one, isn't it? Pilgrim of the Clear Light by Ken Winkler, which is in print again after being very scarce for a number of years. But then, to return to the text, as we've disclosed, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is in actuality the Bardo Todol, or liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. Bardo is the Tibetan word for Antarabhava, Sanskrit, transitional, intermediate. Not all schools of Buddhism accept the existence of an intermediate state, with the Theravadins, who are the sole surviving representatives of the Hinayana school, for example, stating that rebirth is immediate, albeit in one of 31 planes of existence. Now there's 2 points to be made here. As most of these 31 planes of existence are non-physical, this is possibly only a half rejection. And secondly, as theosophists, aren't we lucky only to have to deal with 7 planes instead of 31? Todol equals Bodhi, awakening, and is a synonym for nirvana. The term Bardo is not restricted to the Nyingmapa, and it's also, for example, found in the Mahatma letters, although it's only used once. In Tibetan Buddhism generally, there are 6 Bardos. I will spare you my mispronunciation of Tibetan at this point and just list them in English, although if you try and force me, I maybe at the end try and pronounce them for you. The first Bardo is the Bardo of birth and life, which covers embodied existence. The second Bardo is the Bardo of the dream state. The third Bardo is the Bardo of meditation. The fourth Bardo is the Bardo of the moment of death. Fifth Bardo is the Bardo of the clear light of death after the final inner or pranic breath. And the sixth Bardo is the Bardo of becoming. As we can see, 3 of these Bardos refer to embodied states of being and consciousness. So it would be a mistake in seeing it simply in terms of memento mori. Francesca Fremantle describes Bardo thus. Originally, Bardo referred only to the period between one life and the next, and this is still its normal meaning when it is mentioned without any qualification. With the rise of Mahayana, belief in a transitional period as opposed to immediate rebirth prevailed. Later Buddhism expanded the whole concept to distinguish 6 or more similar states, which I've just gone through, covering the whole cycle of life, death and rebirth. But it can also be translated as any transitional experience. Its original meaning, the experience of being between death and rebirth, is the prototype of the Bardo experience, while the 6 traditional Bardos show how the essential qualities of that experience are also present in other transitional periods. By refining even further the understanding of the essence of Bardo, it can then be applied to every moment of existence, The present moment, here, now, that's me interjecting, is a continual Bardo, always suspended between the past and the future. That's from her book Luminous Emptiness. What the Bardo teachings do tell us is that there are nodal points in our experience, periods, and life is a period between deaths made up of a series of nodal events, when we have the opportunity to step back from an immediate and unquestioning acceptance of the given sensoria and seek both the source of perceptive delusion in ourselves and the root of reality without. In the Theosophical tradition, we have tended to refer to these central events as initiations, and probably, in certain quarters, gone into a little too much detail. But given the Theosophical tenet of the pervasiveness of the field of absolute consciousness, our equivalent of the clear light of bliss, it is also possible that, in the broader scheme of things, trivial events might be able to, given the right circumstances, which includes the ever-important background or history, lead to insights that seem sudden or unplanned. What is at issue here is the value of that preparatory work, where effort is seemingly expended for no visible reward. To use an analogy, without the prior cuts that seem to make little headway at first, the one cut that finally fells the oak tree would bring no result at all, would it? Yeah? Okay, so what I propose to do now is to outline the three Bardos which do specifically relate to the death processes, because it was you were promised the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and then compare them with the traditional account given in the works of HPB and the Mahatma letters, as already mentioned. And now, here comes the Tibetan. There are three Bardos that relate to the various death processes. The moment of death, or Chikai, the luminosity after death, or Chonyi. I've seen that spelt with a D at the end, but I'm assuming that the D is silent. And the rebirth or becoming, which is called Sidpa. Now, the moment of death. The process of death in Tibetan Buddhism is described as the gradual withdrawal of the winds, theosophically it would be pranas, that run through the subtle channels of the body, along with the failure of physical and sensory functions. And there are 8 stages to this. Whether or not in cases of sudden death it's all telescoped into one, I couldn't tell you. I can't remember the last time I died. So, first of all, the body becomes weak and the vision dim. And I've got to say that as I get older, that seems to be a state of affairs that happens pretty constantly, never mind at one stage. Secondly, all physical sensation is lost, and one loses the ability to hear. Now, at this stage, I don't think there's much point in reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead to anybody if the ability to hear is gone. And there's a vision of thick smoke. Third stage, one can no longer remember the names of friends or family, and the warmth of the body diminishes. The fourth stage, breathing stops and the sense of taste goes. The fifth stage is that all the 5 senses have finally expired or gone, and the life winds descend through the central channel to the heart wheel. Interesting that Tibetans put the final death process in the heart center. A clear light is seen. The 6th stage, there's a bright red colour seen due to other winds rising up to the heart wheel. The 7th stage, there's a radiant blackness and the person swoons into unconsciousness. And the 8th stage is where the mind of clear light dawns. This is death. That is kaput. We note from the above that the most subtle form of consciousness is called the mind of clear light, and it appears after unconsciousness, presumably the unconsciousness of the lower self. Some of the lights, such as that in the 5th stage, may be lights that are experienced in a near-death experience, or indeed the near-death experience may relate to that light of clear light of bliss. We tend to assume in talking about near-death experiences that they're all the same, but they're not. any more than during life. Our life patterns are different. We're the same, but we're different. So too with near-death experiences. And so what one person may bring back as a memory of the near-death experience may be from a different stage of that after-death process, abortive after-death process. But back to the text. Note that the text, the Bardo Tadol, calls for various physical interventions to the body of the person undergoing this, which I will omit. Our text tells us, at this moment, the first glimpsing of the Bardo of the clear light of reality, which is the infallible mind of the Dharmakaya, Dharmakaya is the truth body of the Buddha, is experienced by all sentient beings. Okay? So there is actually some disagreement as to just how universal the experiences described throughout the Bardo Tadol are. Evans Wentz believes, with appropriate changes in symbolism, so a Catholic is not going to see a vision of the Buddha, for example. Evans Wentz believes that with appropriate changes in symbolism, the states are the common inheritance of mankind. But Lopez reports Fosco Morini, Secret Tibet, as claiming that the visions are the result of tantric practices and initiations, thus of restricted application. Here, at this point, however, the explicit reference that I just quoted said, all sentient beings. So that actual stage of death it's claiming is the inheritance of everybody. Obviously it would have been everybody in Tibet at the time, but anyway. The next stage is the Chonyi Bardo. Now, about this time, the deceased can see that the share of food is being set aside. This is from the Bardo Tadol. That the body is being stripped of its garments, that the place of the sweeping rug is being swept, can hear all the weeping and wailing of friends, and although he can see them and hear them calling upon him, they cannot hear him. And the text then goes on to say, the body which thou now hast is called the thought body of propensities. That's habit or samsara. Since thou hast not a material body of flesh and blood, whatever may come is unable to harm thee. Thou art incapable of dying. It is quite sufficient for thee to know that these apparitions are thine own thought forms. We can see the Theosophical influence in the use of the term thought form. I think probably the original text would say something like mind made, but Evans Wentz has chosen the Theosophical term thought form. O nobly born, if thou dost not recognise thine own thought forms, whatever of meditation or of devotion thou mayest have performed while in the human world, the lights will daunt thee, the sounds will awe thee, etc. Should thou not know this all-important key to the teachings, thou wilt have to wander in the samsara. MB, we have some points here. There's an emphasis on the mind-made nature of the state here. And there's also a paradox. It seems that practice during life creates visions during this phase of the death state. But the text is telling us that the defunct has to be reminded not to be afraid of their own visions. In a sense, they're saying, do not be not afraid of the projections of your own mind that you've actually built up through years of tantric practice prior to dying. And that's the paradox. I find that paradoxical. Or would it? It certainly seems to have, seems as if a broad hint is being given that, despite the somewhat mechanical idea of tantric practice that may appear in some quarters, reality is never so simple. Yeah? Be that as it may, the next 7 days are concerned with the dawning of what are called the peaceful deities, the Dhyani Buddhas, celestial Buddhas. I see that I've not got that much time left, so fortunately I can skip a little bit. There's basically the first 6 days in the Chonyi Bardo state. Each stage, a different Buddha or Dhyani Buddha appears, okay? And with each Dhyani Buddha, there also appears a lesser light. And the text basically suggests that the defunct will be so frightened by the radiance of the Dhyani Buddha that it will go towards the lesser light. And the lesser light relates to negative qualities, and the greater light refers obviously to the positive qualities. And it's constantly, the text constantly reminds the defunct to not be afraid of the great light, and to shun the lower light. And in some senses, that's something that happens to us all during things when we think, oh, it's something that I should do, but I really don't want to. You know, the lesser path is always easier. And this is constantly going through. The Dhyani Buddhas relate, and there's a very complicated colour scheme and system of correspondence is given. The Dhyani Buddhas relate to different parts of the aggregates that are used in Buddhism, skandhas. So Buddhism breaks down the person into 5 skandhas, aggregates: body, feeling, perception, volitional, and consciousness. And each Buddha relates to an aggregate, has their own distinctive colour and so on. I'm going to come back to that point in a little while. But constantly the defunct is, so basically each day is, the longer the process goes on, each day is a lost opportunity. Yeah. The text tells us here, "O nobly born, these realms are not come from somewhere outside. They come from within the 4 divisions of thy heart, including its centre, making the 5 directions. The deities too are not come from somewhere else. They exist in eternity within the faculties of thine own intellect." Now compare this to Madame Blavatsky, Secret Doctrine 1265. "With all, the monad of every living being, unless his moral turpitude breaks the connection, is an individual Diane Chohan, a kind of spiritual individuality of its own during one special manvantara." And on page 5723, she also talks of those very 5 great elements. The 5, or rather 7, Dhyani Buddhas, also called elements of mankind. Now this is where the symbolism of the text is coming in, because an element is something that makes something up, yes? Dhyani Buddhas are elements of mankind. The Dhyani Buddhas represent spiritual qualities that embody in the human being. And so we can perhaps see the text as expanding that idea. So deeply metaphysical stuff indeed. In essence, what we're being told by HPB here is that the heart of a human being is a Dhyani Buddha. For further clarification on this question, look at what she says about Diane Chohan's in Collected Writings 6. "Ordinarily a man is said to reach nirvana when he evolutes into a Diane Chohan. The condition of a Diane Chohan, which means Lord of Meditation, is attained in the ordinary course of nature after the completion of the 7th round in the present planetary chain. After becoming a Diane Chohan, a man does not, according to the law of nature, incarnate in any of the other planetary chains of this solar system. The whole solar system is his home. He continues to discharge his duties in the government of this solar system." Again, we've got the basic idea coming through, because we often see the Diane Chohans and so on and so forth mentioned in Theosophical texts, but there's no detail. And we think, well, where can you get authentic detail? Well, the Buddhist tradition, the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, Tantric Buddhist tradition, gives solid information. Whether or not it will fit with Theosophy, you each have to individually make up your own minds, yeah? But there's certainly, and when I say information, I don't mean one Dhyani Buddha is called John and another Dhyani Buddha is called Bob. It's talking about abstract spiritual qualities and the way these spiritual qualities manifest, okay? And so this is Blavatsky drew quite heavily on Buddhist sources, although she also claimed to profess something called struggling to find the words, Chaldean Vedic Buddhism, something like that. It's very bizarre. It's Buddhism before the Buddha, a tradition. Anyway, back to the Bardo Tadol. After the peaceful period, then it comes a wrathful period, where things degenerate even more. Remember that in the Bardo, the moment of death is the clearest and most direct perception of the clear line of reality, the Dharmakaya. And then it's a descending cycle. It's not like the Catholic teaching of purgatory, then heaven. It goes in the opposite direction. You start at the pinnacle, and then you start at the beginning. If you've not reached that realization, you begin a slow circle down. So there's a further period, 7 days of wrathful deities, which I don't need to go into details. And the final Bardo, the Sidpa. And this is where the defunct begins the process that will lead to rebirth. And the text tells us that the defunct finds himself in a body, quote, born of desire. It is a thought form hallucination in the intermediate state, and it is called the desire body. So the Bardo Todol, insofar as we use a theosophical approach, seems to begin with Devachan, or some variant thereof, and then proceed to list Kamaloka, the desire world, which is a completely different way around that we put it. And there are various visions that can occur which will decide, which vision you see will decide where you're reborn in one of the 6 realms of Buddhist reincarnation. And it's in the Sidpa Bardo that there is a karmic judgment scene. And the text tells us that thou art suffering so, coming from thine own karma. Pray earnestly to the precious Trinity that will protect thee. If thou neither prayest nor knowest how to meditate upon the great symbol, the good genius who was born simultaneous with thee will come now and count out thy good deeds with white pebbles, and the evil genius will come and count out thy evil deeds with black pebbles. Then the Lord of Death will say, I will consult the mirror of karma. The good genius, Evans Wentz tell us, is the young Chig Kye Paila, simultaneously born God, the personification of a human being's higher nature. The evil genius, the Lan Chig Kye Pai De, is the personification of the lower nature. In theosophical terms, I suggest that what we're dealing with here is the higher self and karmic principles respectively. The text tells us that the mirror of karma, which is a beautiful and powerful image, is infallible, and lying to the Lord of Death is to no avail. The great symbol is the Mahamudra, which is the ultimate truth of emptiness. And the karmic judgment here is depicted in very graphic terms, with the text admonishing the defunct to continually bear in mind that the body that they're inhabiting and experiencing these things in cannot be harmed, because it involves things like dismemberment and so on and so forth. And then there's the moment of rebirth is interesting, because, how to phrase this, the defunct or the discarnate entity is drawn to the place where its future parents are engaged in an act that will bring that later being into creation, okay? And if at this point one develops an aversion towards the father and an attraction towards the mother, then one will be born as a male, and vice versa for being born as a female. And some commentators have suggested that this is a very early version of Freud's Oedipus complex. Anyway, assuming then that a person is reborn, that exhausts it for that particular life. Now, just to briefly contrast this with the account given in the original literature. The original literature has us, and I've drawn this from Geoffrey Farthing's When We Die, the physical process of dying dislodges the memory from the physical brain, and there is an initial past life review. Just after death, it says, the consciousness, the personal consciousness is snuffed out. Now there is mention of unconsciousness in the Bardo state. Then there is a death struggle, which is normally unconsciousness in Kamaloka. a struggle being between the higher and lower elements of the now discarnate entity, a gestation period where the spiritual content realized in the previous stage is assimilated by the reincarnating ego, and the entry into Devachan, which is very much a mind-made world. And by the way, Devachan is a Tibetan term, but perversely they don't exactly spell it the way we spell it, because those of you that come across Tibetan will know that there's all manner of consonants put before words that are not pronounced. But Devachan is a Tibetan term, which is their equivalent of the Sanskrit Sukhavati, the blissful paradise of Amitabha Buddha. So, Theosophy draws an explicit distinction between the reincarnating ego and the personality, okay? And the texts of the Bardo Todol doesn't seem to make that explicit distinction. Remember that this is supposed to be the defunct and constantly in contact, can see people mourning the person's death and so on, okay? Whereas Theosophy teaches that death is a merciful liberator. There's no such thing as post-mortem punishment or suffering in the Theosophical account, with some exceptions, okay? With some exceptions, because death is basically a dissolution, a natural dissolution, and the constituent elements dissolve. And the Mahatma let us describe the after-death states as the world of effects, and this realm is the world of causes. So it's just basically, so that's a big difference. The Mahatma let us tell us that those who know that they are dead in the physical body, which is an interesting term, are either adepts or sorcerers. Now, does this raise the possibility that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is an authentic text? I really, I'm going to take the fifth on that one. Certainly the process is very different. Jean-Louis Simon in the 90s wrote a booklet, Theosophy and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he makes the following points, which I shall end on. The whole process of the afterlife is regulated by karma, which no one can interfere with. The deceased now enters the world of effects. If he had failed to become a conscious Buddha during his existence, he will not be able to reach that stage in the other world. And that's a key teaching of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Todol, is that at any instant you can make that breakthrough. So that's a big difference between Theosophy and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Equally important is the extinction of the personal consciousness under the shock of death. But the Bardo Todol claims to be able to guide him during weeks on this very same basis. However, the text does say if the defunct has not memorized this teaching. So again, there's some wriggle room. The return to earth life is not undergone in a climate of fear and trepidation regarding one's future destiny, unlike exoteric Buddhism. There is again, that's a bit of a broad generalization, but there is certainly in some presentations of Buddhist teachings the idea that this is really a terrible place and we want to get out of it. Aleister Crowley was a friend of Alan Bennett, who was a TS member. We have his membership records at HQ. And Alan Bennett became a Buddhist monk. And sometime in whenever it was, late 1890s, early 1900s, Crowley visited Bennett when he was a monk and was very influenced by Bennett's Buddhism. And when he came back to England, he sent people postcards saying, wishing you a speedy termination of existence. So that's one particular stream or strand within Buddhism. But Theosophy does not do that. As Simon says, according to Theosophy, there is a middle way. The path of that's a middle way between the idea of complete immersion in misery or blissful liberation that walks away from everything, okay? Simon is saying that there is a middle way. the path of an intelligent acceptance of reincarnation as being a wise law of nature. Instead of blindly living his earthly existence, instead of selfishly attempting to put an end to his rebirths, the individual is invited to understand that he belongs to a whole planetary family of human beings. Hence the teaching in the voice of the silence, accept the woes of birth. Now, in an earlier incarnation of this talk given at the previous summer school, I suggested that the order of the visions of the Bardo state might make more sense when they are seen as the journey of the divine ego, initially and more or less liberated from the trammels of the personality towards rebirth. Okay? Now there might be merit in that approach, the twilight language of the text hiding deep truths about the ultimate source of our being. Carl Jung also advocated the reverse approach. He said you should start with the Sidpa, in studying the text you start with the Sidpa and work back, but he had different reasons for that. Similarly, the extravagant language of the text may hide a very simple truth. The ideals which we aspire to and the values by which we measure our actions may well be perfect, but our realization of them will always be provisional and hence imperfect on this plane. But it is perhaps best to let the Bardo Todol have the last word. O nobly born, if one recognize not one's own thought forms, however learned one may be in the scriptures, although practicing religion for a kalpa, one obtaineth not Buddhahood. If one recognize one's own thought forms, by one important art and by one word, Buddhahood is obtained. Thank you.